What does it mean for something to vanish in a world built on tracking, logging, and proof? Picture a night sky over open water. No city glow, no highway hum. Just a slow sweep of moonlight across waves that look identical from every angle. Somewhere above that dark surface, an aircraft moves with steady purpose. Inside, men and women with small rituals, folded jackets, half-finished thoughts, a glance at a watch, a quiet hope to be home by morning. The instruments are lit like a small constellation. The radios crackle with ordinary language. Everything seems normal. Then, in a single, unremarkable moment, the line goes silent. Not a dramatic farewell, not a cry for help, just the sudden absence of a signal where one had always been. We tend to think of modern life as a net, wide, tight, dependable. If you fall, someone will see it. If something breaks, a warning will sound. If a plane goes down, debris will float, beacons will ping, investigators will piece together the story like a careful puzzle. We believe this not because we are naive, but because it is mostly true. Aviation has become one of the great quiet triumphs of human engineering, an achievement measured in routine arrivals and the dull comfort of schedules kept. And yet, scattered across the past century, there are flights that don't fit the pattern, flights that slipped from radar like a thought you can't retrieve, flights that left no wreckage, no oil slick, no life raft, not even a reliable last message. Some disappeared in calm weather. Some were piloted by experienced crews. Some were followed by enormous search operations that found nothing. No metal, no fabric, no trace of the people whose names were printed on passenger lists and family letters. If you've ever stood at the edge of the ocean, you know how quickly certainty dissolves. The water looks close, but it is vast. It can hold a secret with effortless patience. The sky, too, has its own kind of depth, an invisible geography of pressure, radio waves, and human assumptions. We map it with lines and frequencies, but mapping is not the same as knowing. This documentary is not a hunt for sensational answers. It is a study in the uneasy space between what we can measure and what we can only infer. Because these vanishings, 10 in all, across decades and continents, carry a common emotional weight. They leave families suspended between grief and hope. They turn investigators into philosophers. They force institutions, military, airline, government, to speak in careful phrases that often sound like echoes: cause unknown, missing, presumed. In these stories, mystery is not a gimmick, it is a condition. It is what happens when evidence fails, and the human mind, hungry for closure, keeps reaching anyway. We will move through oceans and lakes, across coastlines and mountain ranges. We'll meet a large transport plane that disappeared on a routine route with dozens of soldiers aboard and no distress call. We'll listen to the final calm words of a modern airliner that drifted into an emptier part of the world and never returned in whole. We'll follow a small plane into the night as its pilot reports something he cannot name, his voice tightening with the effort to stay precise. We'll revisit a squadron of military aircraft that lost its sense of direction as if the world itself had turned unfamiliar. Some of these cases come with fragments, a torn panel that washes ashore years later, a logbook entry from a ship at sea, a radar trace that appears and then becomes a dispute. Others offer nothing at all, just the shape of an absence. And in that absence, we find a larger question. When a system built for certainty fails, what do we do with the unknown? Perhaps the point is not to fill the silence with fantasies, but to listen to it, patiently, honestly, to recognize that mystery can be a mirror. It reflects our faith in technology, our trust in institutions, our need to believe that every story has an ending that can be explained. Because the most haunting thought is not that the skies are dangerous. It's that sometimes they are indifferent, that sometimes the world does not provide an answer on demand. So we begin with a simple, unsettling premise. Planes are designed not to disappear, and yet sometimes they do. What is it exactly that vanishes when a flight vanishes? Metal and fuel, yes, but also certainty, and the comforting belief that everything leaving a trace is a rule of life. And if the sky can keep a secret, what does it ask of us in return? What happens when a routine flight carries 93 young lives into the dark, and the ocean refuses to give even a single piece back? It begins on a warm March night in 1962 on Guam, where the air smells faintly of salt and jet fuel, and the runway lights look like a straight line drawn into the unknown. A military charter lifts away from the island with the steady confidence of a practiced machine. Inside the cabin are U.S. Army soldiers, some barely old enough to shave, some already tired in a way youth shouldn't allow, bound for the next stop on a long arc across the Pacific. The aircraft is a Lockheed Super Constellation, a graceful shape with triple tails and a hum that feels to passengers like a promise. The crew has flown similar routes countless times. The weather is calm. The radios work. The navigation is ordinary. In the logic of aviation, this is the kind of flight that should dissolve into history as nothing more than a line item. Departed, arrived, done. Less than 2 hours after takeoff, that line breaks. The last radio exchange is almost painfully normal. Cruising altitude reached, position reported, everything in order. No urgency, no mechanical complaint, no hint of confusion. Then the frequency goes quiet, as if someone has gently turned down the volume on the world. Search and rescue begins the way it always does, with confidence. Planes fan out, ships cut grids into the water, eyes scan for what the mind expects to find: floating debris, a slick of fuel, a flare, something. But the Pacific is not a page you can read at a glance. It is a book with too many blank chapters. Days stretch into weeks. The search expands into one of the largest of its time, and still the ocean offers nothing. No seat cushion, no life vest, no scrap of metal to anchor the story to physics. Some observers report a distant flash, a moment of light on the horizon. Others mention storms that came later, as if the sea waited to cover its tracks. None of it hardens into evidence, and that absence changes everything. For the families, the mind becomes an aircraft of its own, circling the last known position, refusing to land. Grief wants something to touch. Hope wants something to interpret. Even the smallest rumor becomes a kind of oxygen. But without wreckage, without a recorder, without a confirmed end, time does not close the door. It leaves it ajar, and people live in that draft. Investigators can list plausible causes: mechanical failure, fire, an explosion too quick for a distress call. They can sketch probabilities and failure modes, yet every explanation feels like it belongs to a different story, one where the world behaves as expected. This is the first lesson the missing flight teaches. Technology can narrow the odds, but it cannot eliminate mystery. And when 93 soldiers and an 11-person crew vanish into calm weather, we are left with a question that is as much human as it is technical. If the sky can erase a plane without a sound, what else do we assume is permanent simply because It usually is. What if disappearance isn't a single moment, but a slow unthreading, one signal at a time, until even the most advanced systems are left guessing? At an airport in Kuala Lumpur, the night of March 8, 2014, carries the usual quiet choreography. Families stand shoulder to shoulder at the glass. Boarding passes crinkle in palms. A jetliner, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, waits with its nose pointed toward Beijing, as if already imagining the sunrise over another country. Inside the cabin are strangers who will never become anything more than strangers, except in the way tragedy stitches people together after the fact. The takeoff is smooth. The climb is steady. The cockpit voice, calm and practiced, speaks the language of routine. "Good night," the crew says to air traffic control as the plane approaches the boundary between one control region and the next. It is an ordinary phrase, a small politeness that should have been forgotten. And then, almost immediately, the ordinary begins to peel away. First, the plane's transponder stops sending identifying information. On a radar screen, it becomes less of a name and more of a shape. Then other communication systems fall silent too, as if someone is shutting doors in a hallway one by one. No mayday, no report of smoke, no urgent descent, just a gradual loss of the plane's voice in the world's network. What follows is not a clean vanishing, but a confusing after-image. Military radar later suggests the aircraft turned back across the Malay Peninsula, tracing a path that seems deliberate and yet inexplicable. For hours, satellite handshakes indicate the plane remained powered and flying somewhere along a vast arc stretching into the Indian Ocean. It is the kind of data that feels precise until you realize what it cannot say, where exactly the plane was, what was happening inside, whether those hours were controlled, chaotic, or eerily quiet. Search efforts unfold on a global stage. Nations coordinate. Ships scan deep water. Planes fly patterns above an ocean that looks identical from mile to mile. For weeks, the world watches, expecting a reveal, wreckage, a black box ping, a final clue that will let the story settle into a known shape. Then, debris begins to appear, not as an answer, but as a new kind of question. A wing fragment on a beach, a piece of interior paneling, scattered artifacts arriving years later, like messages that have crossed an enormous distance in slow motion. Each piece confirms what everyone feared, yet none explains how the fear became real. In the gaps, theories multiply. Some are careful, rooted in engineering and human behavior. Others reach for the dramatic, because drama feels like meaning. But the most unsettling truth is simpler. When a plane goes missing over deep ocean, the world's greatest technologies become limited by geography and time. The ocean hides wreckage the way night hides a footprint. And so MH370 becomes a modern parable, not about a single flight, but about the limits of certainty in the age of data. We can record more than ever, track more than ever, connect more than ever. Yet one aircraft, in a few quiet minutes, can slip beyond the edge of what the systems were built to guarantee. The question it leaves behind is not only what happened, but what do we do when our instruments can't turn mystery into knowledge? Because perhaps the most human response to a vanishing is not to invent an ending, but to sit with the discomfort that some stories remain unfinished, even in the era of satellites and screens. What if the last thing a pilot ever says is not a plea, but a question, spoken into the dark, as though the sky itself might answer? On the evening of October 21st, 1978, a small aircraft rises from Australia's coast and points itself toward open water. The Cessna 182 is modest, almost ordinary. One of those planes you imagine in daylight, skimming above farmland, not pressing into the black over the sea. Its pilot, Frederick Valentik, is 20 years old, young enough to still feel like he's auditioning for the future, old enough to be trusted with an aircraft and a plan. He tells air traffic control he's headed to King Island, a route that should be straightforward. The weather is good. The visibility is fair. There is no reason to expect anything other than a normal arrival and a tired walk off the tarmac. Then, 40 minutes into the flight, his voice comes through the radio with a change in texture, still controlled, but tighter, as if he is trying to keep his breathing from being heard. He reports an aircraft following him. At first, it sounds like a common situation. Another plane in the vicinity, a potential navigation concern. The controller asks for details. Valentik says the aircraft has 4 bright lights, that it seems to be moving faster than expected, that it is circling above him. He is asked again, can he confirm it's an aircraft? What type? Does he see anything identifiable? His answers turn strange, not because they become sensational, but because they become uncertain. He describes something that doesn't fit a normal silhouette. He says it passes over him, then returns. He says it seems to be hovering, then accelerating. In the pauses between his words, you can feel a young mind trying to force an unfamiliar sight into familiar categories. The controller checks. No known traffic in the area. Valentik's voice stays on the edge of composure. He reports that the object is close, that it's playing some kind of game above him. The controller asks if he is experiencing engine trouble. Valentik replies that the engine is running rough, as if coughing. His final transmission includes a detail that is almost unbearable in its simplicity, a strange, metallic sound. Then the line goes dead. No distress call follows. No emergency locator beacon leads rescuers to an obvious point. A search begins along the expected route, then widens, then repeats. Aircraft comb the water. Boats trace grids. But the sea, calm, indifferent, does not offer wreckage or fuel slick or a life raft. It offers only the hard lesson that small planes can vanish quickly and that open water can absorb evidence the way sand absorbs footsteps. In the years that follow, stories grow around the silence. Some insist it was a bizarre encounter. Others point to the vulnerabilities of night flying, to spatial disorientation, to the way the mind can misread lights against a dark horizon. There are reports of a small piece of aircraft hardware found on an island years later, though nothing conclusive enough to close the case. But whatever explanation one favors, the emotional truth remains. A young pilot spoke to the world as if seeking company in a moment of fear, and the world could not reach him in time. Valentik's disappearance asks a gentle but unsettling question. How much of our confidence in reality depends on light, context, and shared reference points? And when those vanish, when the horizon disappears, when the sky becomes a blank page, how easily can certainty become a story we tell ourselves to stay calm? Perhaps the true mystery is not what he saw, but how quickly the familiar can become unrecognizable when you are alone above a dark sea. What if the most frightening place to lose your way isn't a desert or a forest, but a sky that looks the same in every direction? On December 5th, 1945, the Florida sun sits low and bright, turning the sea into a sheet of hammered metal. At Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers line up for what should be a routine training mission. The plan is simple. Fly east, practice bombing runs over the water, then return. The pilots are young but trained. The aircraft are rugged, familiar. The war has ended, and the world is trying to relearn what normal feels like. This flight is supposed to be part of that normal. They take off in formation and head toward the Bahamas, engines droning in steady unison. Over the water, everything seems ordinary, until it doesn't. Sometime after the bombing practice, the flight leader begins to question his position. He believes they are over the Florida Keys. Others disagree. The radio fills with the sound of men trying to triangulate reality using compass headings, coastlines, and the faint shapes of islands. Then the compasses begin to fail. A broken compass is not a supernatural event. It is a mechanical problem. But in a cockpit, far from land, a mechanical problem can become an existential one. Direction is not just information. It is reassurance. When it slips away, the sky opens into a kind of featureless anxiety. The pilots report that everything looks wrong. The ocean looks unfamiliar. The sun drops toward the horizon, and the light changes the water's color, erasing subtle cues. Clouds gather, a storm line forms, and the air takes on that electric tension that announces weather turning. The radio chatter grows more strained. The flight leader tries to choose a direction, any direction, that might bring them back to land. And here, the tragedy deepens. A wrong decision in that moment doesn't feel wrong. It feels like action, like leadership, like hope. It is the kind of choice a person makes when the alternative is paralysis. As darkness approaches, the voices become fragmented. Some pilots suggest flying west. Some insist east is correct. The flight leader, convinced of his own map, keeps the formation moving into the night. Fuel begins to run low. The probability of ditching rises with every minute. At some point, a final transmission is captured. Words that sound like a man trying to hold his team together as the ocean waits beneath them. Then, silence. The Navy launches a massive search. Planes, ships, and crews scan the region. Another aircraft is sent out to assist, a rescue plane carrying extra fuel and equipment. It, too, disappears, likely lost to an explosion or accident, adding more absence to the already widening gap. No definitive wreckage is recovered, no bodies, no clear endpoint. The sea takes the story and leaves behind only a name that will become a cultural symbol: Flight 19. Over time, myth blooms where evidence is thin. People draw triangles on maps and talk about cursed waters and impossible forces. But if you listen closely, the core tragedy is more human than mystical. It is about navigation, yes, but also about how quickly group certainty can fracture when the environment offers no reliable anchors. It is about the terrifying idea that you can do everything almost right and still not make it home. Flight 19 leaves us with a question that reaches beyond aviation. When our instruments disagree with our senses, what do we trust? And when trust breaks, when the world becomes ambiguous, how much of survival depends not on knowing the truth, but on agreeing on it together? What if the boundary between found and lost is not a line, but a fog, thick enough to swallow certainty, thin enough to keep hope alive? On a July morning in 1937, the Pacific looks deceptively calm from the cockpit of a silver aircraft named for its promise, Electra. Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, are deep into a journey meant to redraw the map of what a woman could do in the modern age. The flight is ambitious, public, symbolic, an arc around the world that turns endurance into a statement. But on the final stretch toward Howland Island, ambition meets geometry. Howland is not a destination in the way people imagine destinations. It is a small, low strip of land, easy to miss even in clear daylight, nearly impossible if cloud layers distort the horizon. The ship assigned to guide them, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca, waits with radios ready, sending signals into the air like flares made of sound. Earhart's voice comes through intermittently, strong but edged with strain. She reports they are close. She reports low fuel. She reports seeing nothing. The radio, that fragile bridge between human beings, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, becomes unreliable. Messages overlap, frequencies mismatch, the timing slips. On the Itasca, men listen and answer and listen again, trying to guide a plane they cannot see toward a speck of land the size of a thought. Then the messages stop. What follows is one of the largest searches of its era, ships fanning out across the Pacific, aircraft scanning the water for any sign of life. There is no wreckage, no oil slick, no rafts, just an expanding grid and an expanding silence. And in that silence, a second story begins, one written not by the sky, but by us. For decades, fragments of possibility surface, reports of distress signals, some credible, many not, rumors of landings on distant atolls, theories of capture, survival, tragedy. Expeditions return with photographs and bones and pieces of metal that might be nothing or might be everything. Each clue becomes a kind of Rorschach test for the human need to resolve unfinished endings. It would be easy to treat the case as a puzzle to be solved, a mystery box with a hidden latch. But what makes Earhart's disappearance endure is not only the question of where the plane went, it's the way it reveals our relationship with uncertainty. Because even in an age when flight was already engineering and bravery, it still carried something older, the mythic logic of voyaging. You leave shore. You enter a space that does not belong to anyone. You trust maps that are only as good as the assumptions beneath them. And if you do not return, you become both a person and a symbol. Earhart was a pilot, not a metaphor. Yet absence turns people into narratives, whether they want it or not. Her story sits at the intersection of progress and vulnerability, proof that humans could cross oceans through the air, and proof that the ocean could still take a modern machine without leaving a trace. So the question lingers, not just about Amelia and Fred, but about all of us. When history refuses to close a chapter, do we keep searching because we believe we can find the truth, or because searching is the only way we know to honor what was lost? What if a plane can be present and absent at the same time, seen by instruments, sensed by people, yet never fully captured by certainty? Over the eastern United States on a cold December night in 1948, a Douglas DC-3 moves through darkness with the steady rhythm of commercial aviation. It is a flight with a small, ordinary purpose: to carry passengers from Puerto Rico toward Miami, with stops that make the journey feel stitched together by familiar geography. The crew is experienced. The weather is not ideal, but it is manageable. The radios crackle with the usual coded calm. Then, near the Bahamas, something begins to unravel. The pilots report trouble, an engine running rough, altitude struggling, conditions worsening. Air traffic control responds with instructions, questions, reassurance. The exchange remains professional, almost restrained, as if both sides believe the problem will settle into a routine emergency procedure: descend, divert, land. But the distance between problem and catastrophe can be thin over open water. At some point, the DC-3 issues a final message. It isn't melodramatic. It's practical. They are ditching. The idea is horrifying in its simplicity. landing a plane on water at night in uncertain seas. Yet crews are trained for it. People have survived it. Rescue aircraft and ships rush toward the reported location, expecting to find floating survivors, wreckage, flares. Instead, they find nothing. The search expands quickly, sweeping the area where the plane was last heard. Aircraft fly patterns at dawn. Ships comb the water. Observers look for the telltale signs, an oil sheen, torn fabric, debris bobbing like punctuation in the waves. But the sea remains blank. Hours become days. Days become a case file filled with coordinates and unanswered questions. And then the reports begin. Strange, difficult to categorize. Some say they saw lights at low altitude. Some claim to have heard engines. Some insist the plane was visible on radar after it should have been gone, as if it continued moving through the night without calling. The details are inconsistent, the sources scattered. In crisis, human perception becomes unreliable, not because people are lying, but because the mind tries to assemble fragments into a coherent picture. Still, the absence remains the central fact. A passenger plane with human beings aboard vanished in a region that should have offered at least something. In aviation, there is an unspoken expectation that failure leaves evidence. Metal bends, fuel leaks, life rafts deploy. Even tragedy has a trail. But when the trail is missing, the imagination rushes in to replace it. The sea becomes not just a physical environment, but a canvas for all the things we cannot bear to leave unresolved. This case, one of several disappearances near the Bahamas, often gets pulled into larger legends about cursed waters. But if you step back from the myth, the sharper truth is about vulnerability. A DC-3 is sturdy, but it is not invincible. Night over water is unforgiving. Weather shifts, navigation errors compound, and in 1948, rescue and tracking systems were not what they are today. A plane could still slip through the gaps, not because the world was haunted, but because it was simply large. The haunting part is what that scale does to us. Because when a flight disappears and leaves no trace, we begin to realize how much comfort we draw from closure. We want a wreck so we can mourn. We want a cause so we can prevent repetition. We want an ending that feels like a period. But the ocean often writes in ellipses. So we are left with a question that is less about the plane and more about the human need to know. When the evidence is gone, do we accept uncertainty as a form of truth, an honest boundary around what we can prove? Or do we keep searching for a story that feels complete, even if completeness is something we invent? What if the last thing the sky gives you is a location, precise, measurable, and then refuses to provide the one thing that location is supposed to promise? An answer. In May of 1979, a small private aircraft lifts off from an airport in Michigan, carrying 3 men and the quiet weight of business and its time. The flight is not famous. It isn't packed with reporters or symbolic ambition. It is the kind of trip thousands of people take every week. An airplane as a tool, a shortcut through distance. The route leads over Lake Michigan, where water can look almost gentle from above. Blue-gray, flat, deceptively simple. But the lake is deep, cold, and wide enough to behave like an inland ocean. It has its own moods, its own weather, its own capacity to keep what falls into it. Somewhere over that water, the aircraft begins to fail. The pilot's voice reaches air traffic control with urgency, but not panic. He reports a problem. He asks for help. There is a clarity to the exchange that feels, at first, reassuring. The system is working. People are listening. Coordinates are being recorded. The lake, in that moment, is mapped and measurable. Then, the signal stops. Rescue teams respond quickly. The aircraft's last known position is identified. Planes and boats race to the area, expecting to find something. In many missing flight cases, the cruelty is that no one knows where to look. Here, the cruelty is different. They know where to look, and still they find nothing. No wreckage rises, no oil slick spreads, no luggage floats up like an unwanted confession. Divers eventually descend into the lake's cold darkness, searching along the bottom where sediment gathers like a slow eraser. Sonar sweeps the depths, translating underwater shapes into grainy suggestions. But Lake Michigan is a place where even large objects can disappear into the geography of mud, currents, and time. And the longer the search continues, the more the lake becomes a metaphor for a certain kind of loss. Not the dramatic loss that announces itself, but the quiet loss that seems to slip through the world's procedures. People on shore imagine the final moments. In a small cockpit, the margin for error is thin. A mechanical issue can cascade. Weather can shift. A disorienting horizon, water and sky blending, can confuse the senses. If a plane goes down, it can go down fast, leaving little time for a controlled ditching. The lake does not roar when it claims something. It simply closes. For the families, a known position without a recovered aircraft is its own kind of torment. It is like being told, "Your answer is here," and then discovering the answer is buried under hundreds of feet of water and years of accumulation. A coordinate can feel precise and still be unreachable. The case also reveals a hard truth about our relationship with technology. We often assume that information is the same as control, that if we know where something is, we can retrieve it. But environments like deep water remind us that knowledge can be powerless without access. A map point is not a guarantee. It is only a marker of where the world stopped cooperating. The lake keeps its secrets in layers: cold water, darkness, silt, and the slow movement of currents. It is not malicious. It is simply thorough. And so the question that remains is not only what happened to that flight, but what do we do with the mystery when it has an address? Because sometimes the modern world gives us coordinates instead of closure. It offers the illusion that the unknown is contained, boxed in by latitude and longitude. Yet even with a pin on the map, the truth can still be out of reach, resting quietly beneath water that looks calm from the surface, as if nothing has ever fallen into it at all. What if the most unsettling disappearances are the ones that don't feel like disappearances at first? Because the plane keeps moving, the systems keep humming, and the world assumes there's time? On a clear January afternoon in 2007, a corporate jet leaves the American Midwest with the quiet efficiency of business travel. A Learjet 35 is built for speed and altitude, for crossing states in the time it takes a person to finish a cup of coffee. Inside are 6 people, the crew up front and passengers behind, expecting nothing more complicated than arrival. Then, somewhere along the route, the jet stops responding. Air traffic controllers try to reach the aircraft. There's no reply. The plane continues on course at cruising altitude, steady and silent, as if it has become a machine running without a human voice attached. In the control rooms below, concern thickens into urgency. A failure of radio contact is not unheard of. But when a plane won't answer at all, when it doesn't deviate, doesn't descend, doesn't acknowledge instructions, the question becomes immediate and frightening. What is happening inside? Fighter jets are scrambled to intercept. As they approach, they can see into the cockpit. What they report is chilling, not because it is dramatic, but because it suggests absence. The crew appears unresponsive. The plane flies on, not in panic or chaos, but in a kind of automated persistence. Eventually, after hours, the Learjet runs out of fuel. It begins to descend, still without communication, and crashes in a remote area. The impact ends the flight, but it does not fully end the mystery. Investigators can piece together a likely chain of events: pressurization failure, hypoxia, gradual incapacitation. The science is well understood. At high altitude, without proper oxygen, the mind dims. Confusion comes first. Judgment slips. Consciousness fades. And when the body gives up, the aircraft can remain stable on autopilot, a ghost of intention. In one sense, this is not a disappearance at all. The plane is found. The story has a physical ending, and yet it belongs in the same family as the vanishings, because it shows how close we can come to losing a flight without the usual signs. No mayday, no frantic exchange, no dramatic final message, just silence and forward motion. It also offers an uncomfortable mirror. We like to believe that crises announce themselves, that danger comes with alarms and clear turning points. But hypoxia is subtle. It can feel like fatigue, distraction, mild euphoria. It can make people underestimate their own impairment. The mind, deprived of oxygen, becomes less capable of recognizing that it is failing. The Learjet's long, silent flight becomes a kind of metaphor for modern vulnerability. The systems can keep functioning while the human capacity to steer them dissolves. The aircraft does not need fear to keep going. It only needs power and a programmed heading. And so, even in a case where the wreckage is recovered and the explanation is plausible, there is still a lingering unease, because the flight reveals a gap between what we assume is happening and what might be happening behind a closed cockpit door. The question it leaves behind is not only about aviation safety, but about perception itself. How often do we mistake motion for agency? How often do we assume someone is in control simply because a system looks stable from the outside? A plane can fly for hours with no one truly present at the controls. And if that can happen in open sky, under watchful eyes, what does it say about the quiet ways life can drift off course before anyone realizes it? What if the most painful mysteries aren't the ones that are completely unknown, but the ones that keep offering small pieces, just enough to reopen the wound, never enough to seal it? On a crisp autumn day in 1953, a commercial aircraft lifts away from the coast of Japan and heads into the wide sky over the Pacific. The flight is part of a world still rebuilding, still traveling, still stitching continents together with routes that feel like proof of progress. Passengers settle in. Crew members move with practiced calm. The horizon is clear enough to believe in. Then, without warning, the plane disappears. No distress call is received. No clear last message sets the scene. Search operations begin with urgency, then expand with frustration. The ocean is vast, and even when weather is favorable, the surface is a kind of moving disguise. A crash can happen in minutes. Evidence can scatter. Currents can pull fragments far from the point where the story ended. Days pass, then weeks, and for a time it seems the ocean has done what it often does, taken the whole truth into its depths. But then pieces begin to arrive. Not all at once, not in a neat cluster that would let investigators reconstruct a final moment. Instead, fragments appear over time, objects washing ashore, items spotted by fishermen, debris discovered at distances that suggest the sea has been carrying the story in slow spirals. Each fragment becomes an event. Each one makes newspapers print the word found, a word heavy with implied closure. Yet found is not the same as explained, because a fragment does not tell you what the cockpit sounded like. It does not tell you whether the passengers were aware. It does not tell you whether a failure was sudden or unfolding. It does not tell you whether someone made the right decision at the wrong time or the wrong decision at the right time. It simply says, the plane ended, and the ocean is now the messenger. In cases like this, the search becomes a kind of negotiation with time. The sea offers evidence on its own schedule. It might give you a wing panel, but keep the fuselage. It might return personal belongings, but hide the flight recorders. It might reveal a clue years later, when the people who needed it most have already reshaped their lives around the missing. And that reshaping is its own quiet tragedy. Families of the disappeared learn to live in two timelines. In one timeline, life continues, work, birthdays, ordinary mornings. In the other, the moment of loss repeats in the mind, held in place by uncertainty. Each new piece of debris becomes a fork in the road. Does it confirm an ending, or does it only deepen the question? Is it mercy to know, or cruelty to know partially? Investigators face the same tension. Every new fragment invites a new theory, a new reconstruction, a new attempt at certainty. But the ocean is a complicated witness. Debris can drift, pieces can be misidentified. The distance between cause and evidence can be stretched by currents and years. And even when identification is solid, context is often missing. This kind of mystery is not blankness. It is incomplete language. Sentences missing their verbs, stories missing their final paragraph. And in that incompleteness, we're forced to confront a human tendency. We want evidence to behave like a key. We want it to unlock the whole door. But sometimes, evidence is only a window, giving a partial view into darkness. So the question that remains is quietly profound. When the world returns only fragments, what do we owe to those fragments? Do we treat them as proof that truth is reachable if we keep looking, or as reminders that some truths arrive in pieces and that learning to live with partial knowledge may be one of the hardest skills a human being ever has to master? What if the most mysterious disappearances aren't dramatic failures, but quiet departures from expectation, small deviations that grow into a vanishing point? In the early morning hours over Southeast Asia, a cargo aircraft climbs into a sky that looks, at first, like every other working night in aviation. Cargo flights rarely attract attention. They move while cities sleep, carrying parcels, machinery, mail, ordinary goods made urgent by commerce. The crew is often lean, the cabin sparse, the rhythm practical. There is no crowd at a gate, no families waving, no cameras waiting for arrival. And yet, when something goes wrong, the absence of spectacle can make the absence of answers even sharper. The flight departs on schedule. Radio contact is normal. The aircraft follows a planned route across long stretches of water and coastline. Somewhere along that corridor, contact becomes irregular. A routine call is missed. A reply doesn't come. Controllers try again. The sky offers only static, as if the air itself has forgotten the plane's name. In many missing flight stories, the last known position is a pin on a map. Here, even that pin feels unstable, because the planes seem to be moving, they're not, transmitting, they're not. present, and then suddenly unaccounted for. Search crews begin with the information they have, but the information is thin. They scan sea lanes and coastlines, looking for smoke, for floating cargo, for any sign that the flight ended in a way the world can recognize. But recognition doesn't come. Instead, the case becomes a study in how modern systems can still produce blind spots. A plane can fly through regions with limited radar coverage. It can pass between jurisdictions where responsibility shifts. Weather can erase visual cues. Night can hide a crash site even a few miles from shore. If the aircraft goes down fast, through mechanical failure, fire, or sudden structural loss, there may be no time for a coherent distress call. And if it goes down into deep water, the evidence can fall beyond practical reach. In the days that follow, reports emerge in fragments. A possible sighting, a suspected oil sheen, a radar trace that may or may not match. Each report becomes a spark. Each spark draws attention, resources, hope, and each time the search arrives, the sea and sky remain blank. The hardest part of such a disappearance is not simply that the aircraft is missing, it's that the disappearance feels like a contradiction. How can something so large, so loud, so engineered, dissolve without leaving a trail that a modern world can follow? We have built systems around the belief that motion creates records, signals, echoes, logs, but those systems are not omniscient. They are human designs, shaped by budgets, geography, and assumptions about where risk is most likely to occur. Sometimes the world reminds us that assumptions are not guarantees. Cargo flights also carry a particular kind of invisibility. When passengers vanish, there are faces on television, names read aloud, birthdays and family photos held up to the camera. When cargo flights vanish, the human story can be quieter, contained within smaller circles, families, colleagues, communities that feel the loss without a wider audience witnessing it. The tragedy is no smaller, but the silence around it can be heavier. And so this chapter becomes less about a single aircraft and more about a pattern. Disappearances that happen in the seams of our systems, where coverage thins and oversight overlaps. The places where the world's net has holes, not because anyone intended it, but because perfection is expensive and the sky is enormous. The question that lingers is unsettling in its simplicity. If a plane can vanish in the gaps between signals and jurisdictions, what does that say about the stories we never notice at all? The quiet losses that occur beyond the edge of our attention. And if the modern world cannot fully seal its own blind spots, how do we learn to live honestly with the truth that some mysteries are not anomalies, but reminders of scale? What if the most haunting mysteries are the ones that leave a message behind, brief, imperfect, and just clear enough to make you wonder what happened in the seconds after? On a winter day in the far north, the light has a particular quality, pale, sideways, as if the sun is reluctant to climb. A small aircraft departs on what should be a manageable route, the kind of flight that locals treat as a bridge between communities. In remote regions, air travel is not glamour. It is infrastructure. It is groceries, medicine, work, and family visits. It is the thread that keeps distances from becoming isolating. The pilot knows this sky. The passengers trust it. Somewhere along the route, the calm begins to change. The aircraft encounters weather, low visibility, shifting winds, the kind of conditions that turn navigation into a constant negotiation. In a larger airliner, redundancy and instrumentation offer layers of protection. In a smaller plane, the margins are thinner. Every decision matters more. Every minute in uncertain weather costs energy, fuel, focus. Then comes the transmission. It is short. It is controlled. It does not sound like panic. It sounds like someone doing what professionals do in trouble, communicating a problem clearly and as early as possible. The pilot reports difficulty, possibly icing, possibly engine issues, possibly losing visual reference. The details are not perfect because in real emergencies, language often fails to keep up with events. The voice is a human voice, shaped by breath and urgency. And then, the radio goes quiet. Search and rescue responds with the speed born of experience. In remote environments, everyone understands the stakes. Planes and helicopters fan out. Ground teams prepare to move across snow and rough terrain. Coordinates are estimated from the last transmission and expected route. A grid is drawn over a landscape where white can hide almost anything. For a time, there are hints, possible signals, maybes that keep hope alive. A flicker of an emergency beacon, a report of something seen against the snow. But hope in these situations is both necessary and cruel. It keeps people searching longer. It also makes every false lead feel like an emotional injury. In many disappearances, the silence is total. Here, the silence is interrupted by that last message, and the message becomes a kind of echo that refuses to fade. It suggests the aircraft was struggling, yes, but also that there was time to speak, time enough to acknowledge the danger, time enough, perhaps, to imagine survival. And that changes the way people grieve, because when you have a final transmission, you can picture the pilot's hands on the controls. You can imagine the passengers hearing the change in engine sound, feeling the shift in altitude, sensing the seriousness in the pilot's voice. You can imagine the moment after the radio went silent, the moment that belongs only to those inside the aircraft and whatever landscape awaited them. If the plane is never found, that moment becomes an unresolved space the mind keeps returning to. It's not just where did it go, but what happened next. The difference is subtle, but emotionally enormous. This kind of case also highlights how thin the boundary is between routine and disaster in aviation. So much depends on weather, maintenance, decision-making, and luck. And in remote regions, the environment adds its own pressure. Fewer alternate airports, fewer ground witnesses, more terrain that can conceal wreckage for years. Sometimes, long after a search ends, the land gives something back, a piece of metal, a personal item, a signal caught by chance. Sometimes, it never does. Either way, the final transmission remains, suspended in archives and memories, a human voice reaching outward in the last moments of control. And so the question we're left with is not only about the aircraft, but about the meaning we attach to last words. When the final thing we hear is a calm report of trouble, does it comfort us because it sounds competent, or haunt us because it suggests there was still a chance? Because perhaps the deepest mystery is not the crash itself, but the unknown space between the last sentence and the last second, where our imagination tries to live because the evidence cannot. What if, in the end, the mystery isn't the vanishing? It's our insistence that every vanishing must have a single, clean explanation. Stand at the edge of an empty runway at dusk and listen. At first, you hear almost nothing. Then, slowly, the world fills in. Distant engines on a highway, insects in the grass, the low shudder of wind against metal. An airport is a place designed to make movement orderly. It turns the impossible into a schedule. It teaches us, through repetition, that departure is temporary, and that is why disappearances feel like a rupture in reality. They break the pattern we depend on. By now, we've traveled through stories separated by decades and geography, yet linked by a shared shape. A military transport gone quiet over the Pacific, leaving a generation of families without a grave. A modern airliner that slipped beyond the reach of its own data trail, turning satellites into witnesses who could only gesture toward a vast ocean. A young pilot alone at night, describing something he couldn't name, then leaving only static behind. A squadron over Florida, trapped in disagreement with their own instruments as weather and darkness closed in. A plane with a known last position that still could not be retrieved because deep water can make knowledge powerless. We've also seen a different kind of vanishing. A jet that kept flying after the people inside may have already been lost to something invisible, like oxygen quietly disappearing. We've felt how debris can offer proof without clarity, and how a final radio call can be both a gift and a bruise. Put together, these cases form less of a conspiracy and more of a landscape, the landscape of the unknown, shaped by physics, human limits, and the sheer size of the world. The human mind hates that landscape. We are meaning makers. We build narratives the way we build shelters. When evidence is thin, we reach for something sturdy. A villain, a hidden force, a secret plan. A mythic triangle drawn on a map. We do this not because we are foolish, but because uncertainty feels like standing on a floor that might not hold. But the sky does not owe us a story. The ocean does not provide closure. Nature keeps its own counsel. At the same time, it's important to be honest about what mystery is not. Mystery is not permission to abandon discipline. The most respectful response to these disappearances is careful thinking, engineering analysis, search technology, transparent investigation, and the humility to say, we don't know when we don't. Mystery should make us more rigorous, not less. And perhaps that is the quiet progress hidden inside these tragedies. Each disappearance changes aviation. It leads to better tracking, improved emergency beacons, stricter maintenance procedures, refined training in spatial disorientation and weather decision-making. It teaches investigators where the gaps are, and it forces systems to tighten their nets. Yet even with those improvements, something remains irreducible. The world is still large, and our reach is still finite. If you listen closely, these stories are not really about planes. They are about human beings moving through environments that do not share our priorities. They are about families living with unanswered questions. They are about the way hope can become a form of endurance, and how grief can become a kind of love that refuses to leave. So here, at the end of our main chapters, we arrive at a final threshold. Not a conclusion, but a reframing. Maybe the question isn't, how could a plane disappear? But why does disappearance unsettle us so deeply? Is it because it exposes the limits of our technologies? Or because it reminds us that certainty is not a permanent state, but a temporary arrangement? And if that's true, then perhaps the most human response is not to force an ending, but to hold the unknown with care, to let it teach us humility, to let it sharpen our compassion, and to let it remind us that what we call mystery is sometimes just the world being larger than our explanations. What do we do with a story that ends in silence? Not the silence of peace, but the silence of missing pages. The kind that makes you reread what came before, searching for the line you skipped, the clue you failed to notice, the moment when the world began to tilt toward absence. In the wake of every vanished flight, there is a ritual that repeats across countries and decades. A list of names is published. A timeline is drawn. A search grid is traced on maps like a promise. People gather at airports and harbors, watching for any sign that the story might return in one piece. And when it doesn't, the world moves on, in public, while private lives stay suspended. It's easy to talk about airplanes as machines. Aluminum, fuel, systems, procedures, but the real cargo of flight is always human. It is birthdays and unfinished arguments, love letters and work plans, a soldier's last joke, a pilot's steady hands, a passenger's quiet hope that the turbulence will pass. When a flight vanishes, it takes more than bodies and metal. It takes the certainty that the future is something we can reliably reach. It forces a strange form of grief, one that must live without a complete ending, one that learns to carry ambiguity like a weight that never fully sets down. And yet, there is also something honest in admitting that not every story resolves. The world is not a courtroom where every case is closed. It is not a novel where every thread ties neatly at the end. Sometimes the truth exists, but it remains out of reach, too deep, too dispersed, too erased by time and water. That doesn't mean the search was meaningless. Search is a form of respect. It is what humans do when they refuse to let another human become a mere statistic. It is what communities do when they insist that someone mattered enough to be looked for. Even when the ocean does not return what it took, the act of looking says, "You were here and your absence has a shape." Over the years, the world has tried to reduce the number of vanishings by building better nets, satellite tracking, improved beacons, stronger international coordination, smarter search tools. Each advancement is a kind of answer, not to the old mysteries, but to the future ones we hope to prevent. Progress doesn't erase the past, but it can honor it by learning. Still, even with all that, the unknown remains part of the human experience, not as a threat, but as a boundary, like the horizon itself. We can sail toward it, we can measure it, we can approach it again and again. But it keeps reminding us that there is always more beyond our current sightline. So perhaps the lasting value of these vanished flights is not in the theories they inspire, but in the humility they demand. They invite us to hold two truths at once, that we should keep improving, keep investigating, keep caring, and that sometimes, even with all our effort, the world will not yield every answer. In that space, something quietly human emerges. We learn that certainty is not the foundation of meaning. Love does not require proof to be real. Memory does not need a recovered wreck to be valid. A life does not become less significant because its ending is unclear. If anything, the unanswered question can become a form of reverence, a reminder to treat the ordinary with tenderness, because the ordinary is fragile. And so we end where we began, under an open sky, above a dark sea, with instruments glowing like small stars. The question is still there, but it has changed shape. Not only what happened, but how do we live with what we cannot know? And maybe the most timeless answer is this: we live by searching when we can, by accepting when we must, and by remembering steadily, gently, that the measure of a life is not how neatly its story ends, but how deeply it was held by others while it was here.